The morning sun cast a golden hue over the sprawling fields of Green Valley Farm, a patchwork of corn, wheat, and soybeans that stretched as far as the eye could see. For generations, the farm had been the lifeblood of the Thompson family, a testament to their hard work and dedication. But on this particular morning, the tranquility of the countryside was shattered by a sound that didn't belong, a deep, rolling rumble that grew louder with each passing second. At first, I thought it was a storm brewing on the horizon, but the sky was clear, not a cloud in sight. Then I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of corn stalks snapping under the weight of something heavy. My heart raced as I bolted from the porch, my boots kicking up dust as I ran toward the source of the noise. And there it was, a massive, gleaming black pickup truck barreling straight through my cornfield. The tires chewed through the crops as if they were nothing but grass, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The driver didn't slow down, didn't hesitate. He just plowed through, his face obscured by the glare of the sun on his windshield. I stood there, frozen, watching the devastation unfold. Months of hard work, every stalk planted by hand, every row watered and cared for, destroyed in a matter of seconds. My blood boiled as I stormed forward, my hands clenched into fists. The truck skidded to a stop near the barn, and the driver stepped out like he had just pulled into a parking lot. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a cocky swagger, his designer jeans and polished boots a stark contrast to the dirt and debris he had just dragged onto my property. His name was Brad, and he was the kind of man who thought the world owed him something. "Mind telling me why you just drove straight through my cornfield?" I asked, my voice tight with anger. Brad adjusted his sunglasses and smirked. "Relax, man. It's just corn. It grows back." I stared at him, waiting for some sign that he was joking. But he wasn't. He was completely unbothered, as if he had just done me a favor. "That corn happens to be my livelihood," I snapped. "You destroyed an entire row. That's money out of my pocket. Do you have any idea how much work goes into?" "Oh, don't be so dramatic," he interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "I was in a rush, and this is the fastest way to the main road. Your driveway is way over there, and I didn't feel like going all the way around." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "That's because my driveway is for people who are supposed to be here, not trespassers." Brad scoffed, crossing his arms. "It's not trespassing. I've been through here before." That was the final straw. I had let him slide too many times, let him get away with too much. But this was different. This wasn't just cutting through my field on foot or taking a few ears of corn. He had wrecked my land, disrespected my work, and the worst part was, he didn't care. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "You ever do this again, Brad, and I promise you, you'll regret it." He laughed, actually laughed. "What are you going to do? Put up a little no trespassing sign? Maybe a scarecrow?" I met his gaze, my anger simmering into something colder, sharper. "Oh, don't worry. You'll see." Brad rolled his eyes, muttered something about uptight farmers, then climbed back into his truck. The engine roared to life, and with one last smug smile, he sped off, right back through my field. I stood there, watching as he disappeared over the hill, his tires churning up dirt and stalks like a tornado had just passed through. My jaw tightened as my farmhand, Sam, walked up beside me, shaking his head. "You going to let him get away with that?" he asked. I exhaled slowly, a plan already forming in my mind. Not a chance. Brad had spent too long walking all over people, acting like rules didn't apply to him. But he was about to learn something important about country folk. We don't take kindly to entitled people destroying what we've worked for. If he wanted to use my land as his personal highway, fine. But the next time he tried it, he wouldn't be leaving so easily. I glanced at the tire tracks embedded deep in my soil, then looked over at the thorn bushes growing along the back fence. Thick, strong, and covered in razor-sharp spikes. A slow smile spread across my face. "Oh, he's in for a surprise," I muttered. Over the next few days, I watched and waited. Brad was predictable. He had that smug confidence, the kind that made him think he was untouchable, that rules were for other people. He'd be back. I knew it. And when he came, he was going to learn a lesson he'd never forget. I wasn't the kind of man to let something like this slide, not when it came to my land, my work, my livelihood. He had driven through my field like it was his personal road, laughing in my face when I told him to stop. That wasn't just disrespect, that was a challenge. Sam was the first to bring up the idea. We were standing by the fence, looking at the deep tire tracks carved through my crops, when he gave me that sideways grin of his, the one that usually meant trouble. "You ever hear about those strips cops use?" he asked, kicking at the dirt with his boot. I gave him a look. "You got some lying around?" "Nope, but we got something better." He jerked his chin toward the back fence, where the wild thorn bushes grew thick and tall, their branches woven together in a tangled mess of spikes. "Bet you Brad's fancy tires wouldn't hold up too well against those." It was a simple idea, but the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. Thorn bushes were just part of the landscape out here. Nobody would question them, not even Brad. And they had a special kind of poetic justice. He wanted to act like he could roll through my farm without consequence. Fine. Let him try. That night, under the cover of darkness, Sam and I got to work. We cut down thick branches of thorns, sharp as nails, and laid them out right in the path where Brad had driven before. But we didn't stop there. We mixed in something extra, old, rusted nails from the barn, hidden among the branches. Just in case the thorns weren't enough to ruin his tires, I wanted to make sure he felt it, right down to his wallet. By morning, everything looked just as it always had. The bushes blended in naturally, a little patch of nature reclaiming the land he had so carelessly torn through. There were no signs, no warnings, just a trap waiting for the right fool to fall into it. I didn't have to wait long. That afternoon, right on schedule, the sound of an engine cut through the quiet. I sat on my porch, pretending to read the newspaper, as the familiar black pickup truck came barreling down the hill. Brad hadn't even hesitated. He didn't slow down, didn't look around. He just assumed, like always, that he could do whatever he wanted. Then it happened. The first tire went with a loud pop, followed by the second, then the third. A horrible screeching noise filled the air as his truck jerked sideways, lurching to a stop right in the middle of the mess. Dust and bits of thorn bush flew into the air as the truck rocked back and forth. From where I sat, I could see Brad's hands flailing inside the cab, hear his muffled screams of frustration. I took my time getting up, strolling toward the wreckage like I had all the time in the world. By the time I reached him, he was already out of the truck, standing in the middle of the field with his hands on his hips, red-faced and furious. "You!" he shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "What the hell did you do?" I raised an eyebrow, keeping my face neutral. "Do? Me? I didn't do anything. You sabotaged my truck. Look at my tires." He gestured wildly at the shredded rubber, the deep gashes where the thorns and nails had done their work. I leaned in, pretending to examine the damage. "Huh. Looks like you ran over something nasty." I glanced around, playing dumb. "You didn't happen to drive through a patch of thorn bushes, did you?" His nostrils flared. "You put those there on purpose." I shrugged. "Brad, I've told you before, this is my land. If you drive through it, you take your chances." His hands clenched into fists. "I'm calling the cops." I nodded, not the least bit concerned. "Go right ahead." He fumbled for his phone, punching in numbers with enough force to nearly break the screen. I just stood there, waiting, enjoying the way his face shifted from rage to frustration to something dangerously close to panic. A few minutes later, a familiar blue and white cruiser rolled up the dirt road, dust kicking up behind it. Sheriff Daniels stepped out, adjusting his belt as he took in the scene. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, the type who had seen more than his fair share of ridiculous disputes in this town. When he saw me standing there, arms crossed, and Brad pacing next to his wrecked truck, he sighed. "What is it this time?" he asked, rubbing his forehead like he already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. Brad stormed up to him. "This man, this criminal, sabotaged my vehicle. He laid out spikes or something. My truck is ruined." Daniels looked at me, then at the field, then back at Brad. "You drove through his land again, didn't you?" Brad faltered for half a second before recovering. "That's not the point. He can't just set traps like this. It's illegal. I'll sue." Daniels scratched his chin, looking about as unimpressed as I felt. "Well, now let's think about this. You've been warned before about trespassing, haven't you?" Brad's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "That doesn't matter. He can't do this." Daniels took a slow step forward, lowering his voice just enough to make Brad flinch. "Actually, it does matter. And what he did isn't illegal. These here are natural thorns, growing wild. If you drove into them, well, that's on you. Brad opened his mouth, then closed it, his eyes darting between me and the sheriff. For the first time, he looked uncertain. But my truck. Daniels sighed. I'd say that's going to be an expensive fix. Brad let out a strangled noise, somewhere between a gasp and a growl. I'll take this to court. Daniels didn't even blink. You go right ahead. But I got to warn you, our judge, he owns a farm too. For a long moment, Brad just stood there, seething. Then, with an angry huff, he turned on his heel and marched back to his truck, kicking the dirt as he went. He yanked open the door, climbed inside, and slammed it shut. The engine revved, but the tires weren't going anywhere. I leaned against the fence, watching as the realization hit him. Going to be a long walk to town, I said, just loud enough for him to hear. He screamed in frustration, smacking the steering wheel. Sam walked up beside me, whistling low. Reckon he learned his lesson? I smiled, tipping my hat back. Not a chance. But he sure as hell won't forget it. Brad sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. I could see his chest rising and falling with every furious breath he took. The truck wasn't moving, not with 4 destroyed tires and bits of thorn bush still tangled in the undercarriage. He punched the dashboard, let out a frustrated scream, then pulled out his phone. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was calling for backup. Probably his wife, or maybe one of his equally entitled friends, who would come riding in, thinking they could talk their way out of this mess. I wasn't worried. He had already lost. It was just a matter of how long it would take for him to realize it. Sam nudged me with his elbow. Think he's calling a tow truck? I chuckled. If he's got any sense, he is. But knowing Brad, he's probably trying to get someone to come yell at me for ruining his day. Sure enough, he shoved the door open a few minutes later, stepping out like he had just been personally victimized. His designer boots crunched against the dirt, his expensive sunglasses perched on top of his head as he marched toward me. You're going to pay for this, he spat, his voice trembling with rage. I tilted my head, pretending to consider it. Pay for what, exactly? You drove through my land, hit a natural obstacle, and now your truck's stuck. I don't see how that's my problem. His face twisted in frustration. You did this on purpose. You set a trap for me. I shrugged. If I had, you wouldn't have seen it coming. That only made him madder. He threw up his hands, turning in a circle like he was waiting for someone to back him up. But there was no one, just me, Sam, and the wide-open fields that weren't going to magically fix his problem. Daniels cleared his throat from where he leaned against his cruiser. Far as I see it, Brad, you've got 2 options. You call a tow truck and pay to get this mess cleaned up, or you wait here until someone comes along willing to help you out. Brad turned on him. Aren't you supposed to be on my side? You're the sheriff. Daniels raised an eyebrow. I'm the sheriff, not your personal assistant. Brad's mouth opened, then snapped shut. He was used to getting his way, used to people bending over backward to keep him happy. But out here, his money and his attitude didn't mean a thing. He was just another person who had to deal with the consequences of his own actions. I could see it dawning on him, that slow, painful realization that he was truly stuck. He looked back at his truck, then at me, then at Daniels. This is ridiculous, he muttered, pulling out his phone again. Sam leaned in close. Think he's calling the tow now? I smirked. Either that, or he's looking up how to hitchhike. Brad paced back and forth, muttering under his breath as he waited. Every so often, he'd glare at me like I was personally responsible for his bad decisions. After what felt like an eternity, a tow truck finally arrived, kicking up a cloud of dust as it pulled onto the property. The driver hopped out, took one look at the truck, and let out a low whistle. Looks like you had yourself an adventure, he said, tipping his hat. Brad scowled. Just get it out of here. The driver didn't argue. He got to work, pulling out the chains and hooking them up to Brad's vehicle. The whole time, Brad stood off to the side, arms crossed, foot tapping impatiently. When he finished, the driver walked over to Brad and handed him a clipboard. That'll be about $500 for the tow, he said matter-of-factly. Brad's face went pale. $500? Yep. And that's just to get it to town. Repairs are another story. Brad looked like he was about to explode. His hands trembled as he pulled out his wallet, his perfectly manicured fingers clutching his credit card like it was his last lifeline. He shoved it at the driver, muttering curses under his breath. I watched the entire thing unfold with the kind of satisfaction you only get when justice is served. He had walked onto my land, acted like he owned the place, and now he was paying the price, literally. As the tow truck pulled away, dragging his poor, battered truck behind it, Brad turned back to me one last time. "You'll regret this," he said through clenched teeth. I smiled. "Doubt it." He stormed off down the dirt road, kicking at rocks as he went. It was a long walk back to town, and I had a feeling he'd be fuming the entire way. Sam let out a low whistle. "That was beautiful." I nodded. Better than I could have planned. The next few days were quiet, peaceful. Brad didn't come back, at least not right away. But word spreads fast in small towns, and it didn't take long before everyone knew what had happened. I heard it at the diner, at the feed store, even at the farmer's market. People laughed, shook their heads, and told me it was about time someone put Brad in his place. Then, about a week later, he showed up again. This time, there was no truck, no entitled smirk. He pulled up in an old rental car, parked at the edge of my driveway like a normal person, and walked up to my porch. I watched from my chair, sipping my coffee, waiting to see what he'd do. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and spoke. "I might have overreacted," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "You don't say." He pursed his lips, clearly struggling with whatever words he was trying to force out. "I'm not saying what you did was fair, but I shouldn't have driven through your field." I set my cup down and leaned forward. "Go on." His jaw tightened. "And I won't do it again." I nodded. That's all I needed to hear. He exhaled sharply, like admitting that it physically hurt him. Without another word, he turned, marched back to his car, and drove off. Sam stepped onto the porch, watching him go. Think he learned his lesson? I leaned back in my chair, stretching my legs out in front of me. Probably not. But he knows one thing for sure. Sam smirked. "What's that?" I grinned. "Next time, it won't just be thorns." Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.